It's all about Knight Rider when I have the huge pleasure of continuing my talk with Knight Rider producer and writer Tom Greene. I don't know if you saw the first part of this interview, but today we'll continue talking about Knight Rider as a show. We'll talk more about the characters. So I hope you enjoy all the memories of Knight Rider producer and writer Tom Greene. Okay, so your role as a producer, among other things, was to keep the integrity of the show. Can you enlighten us a bit about the thoughts about how Knight Rider should evolve as a show? Also, of course, the main characters. Any of the thoughts during your time on the show?
That's a good point. I was a bit concerned about one thing, which was, and there were little bits of it that we snuck out, and that Larson didn't do it. I wrote many Bibles, and of course, you know what Bibles are on shows.
Yeah.
My Bibles sometimes were, 60, 70 pages, and it would be on everything, the look of the show, this, but most important, which a lot of actors and features and stuff who do stuff, the older actors do this, they will write elaborate backstories about who the character is, where they're born, where things that happened to them in their youth, where they went to school, accidents they've had, bad things they've done, good things, people they loved, things they lost, None of it is ever used, but it does create it. And when I would do Bibles, and a lot of Bibles, and still, for all your characters, will write very strong backstories, and it helps you. Now, we end up doing superficial things, which you always have the ex-girlfriend who comes back into your life. We even did one with Devin's old girlfriend, if you remember.
Yeah.
Well, you want to make it even more significant. And the thing that concerned me on the show was, obviously, the whole show is predicated on a little bit of a backstory of Michael Long, Michael Knight. But you didn't really know what was Michael Long. Now, there also was a show, of course, where somebody knows that Michael Long isn't really dead, and now he's Michael Knight, and now he's going to... These are great stories, but they're the obvious. But we didn't really go deeper with him. Devin, we didn't do it, and her, we didn't do it. And those really are the three main characters. We didn't go into who they were, and that bothered me a little bit, because then when you invent things, for example... there's a story that I tell, and so I won't be telling it again here, and everyone can go to on the YouTube, of course, and if you just put in my name, Tom Greene, Greene, Knight Rider speech is where you, I think, saw me. You'll see my keynote speech for a huge convention in London, and in it, because sadly Edward Mulhare had passed away around that time, they did ask me to tell an Edward Mulhare story. I have another one I could tell you guys, which I absolutely love, but that's that story about the motorcycle, if you know that. And I'm very proud of that and how I handled it. But I even think I mentioned it in that there, and I think Return to Goliath, I think it was, where they end up in jail together. He talks about how he was, basically in MI1 or whatever. He was in like the James Bond Secret Service, and that he has a thing, and to get them out, called Spy's Bread, and he's able to take, the stays of his shirt and the filament and this and that, and he mixes it together, and somehow it becomes like a plastic explosive, and they're able to blow themselves out. And he talks a little bit about his days when he was, in that. And as you know, I wrote that after, for him, to give him more to do, so he's not just behind the desk always saying, "We have a prince who has been kidnapped by a little Indians." He hated doing that. But it was wonderful, because then I didn't realize that Edward Mulhare had experience somewhat like that. And we had lunch once, and we never got to use it, but he was telling me all these stories. And I just think it would have made the Devin character, he reminded me a little bit of, years ago, there was a show called Man from U.N.C.L.E. When I was a tiny kid. It was my favorite show. And Waverly something was Leo G. Carroll played the Devin character. And he was the one who gave Kiriakin and Napoleon Solo their assignments. But being Leo G. Carroll, he always prefaced it by something in his past life or something he had done, which always made his character so wonderful. So that was, something that bothered us a lot, and made it, and I think kind of superficially the show. And why you say, why did you just create it? In those days, the sad part was, if we were to have developed a backstory, let's say for the Devon character, we would have had to have sent that and submitted, even though it's never used, the backstory to the network. And we had learned, all of us from past experience, that if you tried to create a backstory of a character that's currently on a show, they drive you absolutely crazy, and for whatever reason. So yeah, so that was a concern on that. I think you asked me something about you were asked about Glenn Larson.
Yeah, Glenn Larson.
There isn't a lot to say. I met him maybe 3 times. He gets credit for developing amazing television. And at one time at Universal, he broke the record. I believe in one season he had 4 shows picked up. I think one's called Automan, Wolfen, Masquerade, and something else. He had all of them were terrible and they all bombed, but he could get anything done. I wasn't, I'll just be really honest. He wasn't a bad guy. I didn't get to know him enough to know anything about him, but I was not a fan of him. He was, in my case and people I knew around him, he was not a friendly man. We would do conventions. He knew who I was. We did all these, and he wouldn't even acknowledge my existence. Not that he had anything against me, not that it was an anger, but that was his focus. He just wasn't into that kind of thing. He did something kind of interesting and very much, he did, but you looked at his shows. Alias Smith and Jones was a complete ripoff of Butch Cassidy. Needless to say, we know what Battlestar Galactica was, and if you go to his shows, what he would do is he would take a show. As a matter of fact, Knight Rider, if you know the story of that, they had to pay George Romero, I think is his name, who did a motorcycle show called Knight Rider.
Yeah, a feature film.
Feature film.
Yeah.
And they were sort of like medieval. There was in modern day, but they were like medieval, warriors. And they had, and I'm sure this is what it was. The billboard for that show, when you came off that 2 hours ago, when I talked about that entrance to Universal, on the outside, the billboard was for that Knight Rider. And it's no coincidence that he ended up using Knight Rider, and I think it was spelled the same. I could be wrong, because they were the Knights of whatever. And Universal ended up paying Romero, substantial money because he was suing them. You can't sue for a title, but there was some kind of quirky thing in there that he was able to do. But the one thing he did, which was really interesting, this is somewhat a prophetic, although people are not prophetic, but but people who knew him very, very well told me he worked really hard on his earlier shows. And there was actually, it's where we shot that last scene with Devon in Speed Demons, where I told you where he wouldn't use the motorcycle. Yeah. And I forgot her name. She was Garland. Beverly Garland was an actress, and she had a hotel near Universal called the Garland Hotel, and that's where we shot that sequence. He had a permanent room there, and sometimes because he didn't want to go all the way home wherever he lived. But now we're talking about 1982, or even before that first show, 1980. He had done all these shows before, and basically they were the same plots all the time. And this is, we used things called typewriters back then, which is a whole other story. There were no computers, but he used a computer, a Commodore, I think, or a K-Pro, but he also had this thing which was way, way over the top of futuristic, and he could feed a script page into it, and they have them now, but and it would read the print and convert it to digital and convert it to Word. So that all he had to do was he would take old scripts, feed it in there, put it in the computer, replace the character names and a couple of other things, and then read his new script for his new show. That was the kind of thing he did. But he, as I said, for whatever reason, had in my experience, and I was very involved in the show, he had nothing to do with the production of the show at all. But as I say, unlike Magnum PI, that was his baby. I mean, he came up with it, he created it, in the beginning. I think worked with Bob Senator for a while on it, so you give him credit for that. But he was I don't know. Last thing I'll say about him, and this is just purely my own opinion, he was a massively successful person, and deservedly so. I mean, when you look at his track record and what he did, and his shows, near the end, his shows weren't, but, he had huge hits on his shows. But I found something kind of unhappy about him, and I don't know what it was, as a person. But God love him. I mean, he gave God, and outwardly got us all work. So God love him for that. Anyway, the thing that's so funny when you talk about typewriters, which I think I may have mentioned my other thing, I have an assistant now. She's 28, so she's not a child. And she was going through some stuff in my storage area, looking for things. And she came across a Selectric typewriter that was all bagged in there. And did you know she didn't know what it was?
No.
She said, "What is this? How does this work?" And it was, now I will say maybe if it was the old style typewriter that you could still see in movies, which is the first my dad when I first went to Universal, I used my dad's. He wrote longhand, but my mom would type up his scripts, and it was a typewriter that was made in 1932.
Yeah.
And I brought it to the studio. She didn't know because if you remember, the Selectrics had a ball in the middle.
Yeah.
So he had no idea what it was. But we used to use typewriters back then. And but the thing about making changes, you talk about writing. It's funny because in computers now we have a thing called cut and paste.
Yeah.
Those expressions. Well, it's because we literally would take a page, and if we had a scene we would really cut that scene, and then we would paste it further down, and then staple on. And then if we were adding or changing dialogue, we would draw these like in cartoons, we have these little balloons, and then you have the dialogue. Yeah. We'd literally draw a balloon, put the dialogue, get an arrow, and say, "This goes here." It was really kind of funny. But I have it. I would love to see studies on this, because there was something about the permanency that when you had to put paper into a typewriter and you had to write, made you think differently, made you think more. And now things are, you can just put stuff in, change. I don't know, and I don't know if it's better. Because that was big. No.
My kids, when they saw a typewriter, they said, "Well, that's interesting. It prints while you write."
That's right. Yeah, that's true. And I was blown away. And I remember I had a girlfriend and came down to my office at home, and I was typing something, and I had the Selectric then that had that white tape. And you would backspace, and it would lift letters off.
Yeah.
But I was to the point where I could go, something, and then go, and it would just disappear on the page. I do it that quickly. I remember she says, "Oh my God," she said, and she actually said, "Is it ever going to get better than that? I mean, how can this be improved?"
That's amazing. So, okay.
Yes.
Maybe more good stories about the cast. Thoughts about now we're going to talk more about David and Michael, of course. Thoughts about April, and then you worked with Bonnie, with Rebecca and Patricia as well.
Yeah, as I said, and I mentioned this before. As I think most people were, we all had huge crushes on Patricia. She was.
We did.
And, because she was remarkably friendly. Now, here's something you should know that I don't really know about the Knight Rider crew. It was one of the only crews for all the years, especially John, the cinematographer, and the others. They were together for the entire group, and they were a huge family. They used to hang out together. They'd go to each other's house, and their birthday parties, and their brisses, and their baptisms, and their July 4th, and they loved each other. And I have to be honest, some of them in some of the areas were not the best in the world, but they were so dedicated and And I got to see David treated them like God. You know, he had gifts and things for them, and always knew their birthdays, and they knew his. And everyone that I realized, who cares? I'll give you an example. I think it's a night. Yeah, it was a Nightmares when David goes to his old precinct. In it, there was a thing that says there was a sign that would say precinct whatever, right? You know, that's like in grass, whatever. You know, next to the door. And you know, you have what's called a table conference before you do the show, and all the department heads and the producer and the director and everyone is there, and you go page by page. Okay, what's needed here in effects? What's needed here in stunts? What's needed here? And then when you get that, okay, art director. Okay, we're going to need a sign. What do you want? You want a grass? You want the okay. So, and I said, I'll make sure we have a sign. I went to the location, and this is where we can put it. And the communication, when I went to the set, I looked up, and I don't know if you have those there, but instead of an old brass engraved sign says precinct, it was one of these like you have for sale, artichoke 67 cents, this big white banner, for like you'd have in a supermarket. Precinct. So I don't know where the communication went off, and I had to. So all we did is we took it off and we made sure not to shoot that, and I think we went back, to get us an establishing shot later with the actor. So they would do stuff like that. But they were all, wonderfully, good people. The reason I bring all that up is they adored Patricia. Yeah. And Patricia, and of course they adored and Edward Mulhare, who could be a great curmudgeon, and I have a really good other curmudgeon story I've never told about him, doing a very sweet thing, and of course David, and so as you know, everyone was really shocked when the network, and it was 100% the network, that our studio exec, we were against it. We fought against it. David really fought against it, but they said she's not pretty enough, or we need more, hot babe, anything. And, so they brought in Rebecca Holden. Now, Rebecca is a perfectly nice person. As I said to you, one people we may not know, because when you see her, and she is what she is. She is this very much like you'd see on these reality shows of someone who's, a model and, into the clothing and Rodeo Drive and the great perfumes, and going to all the big parties and all. And nothing's wrong with that, but that's a different kind of lifestyle. But I will say about Rebecca, I've been a cowboy in rodeo mostly for charities, as I've told you, and had horses all my life. But I also got Roy Rogers taught me to shoot trap and rodeo, and I did a lot of trap events. And I even was involved for 16 years in this wonderful town, Warsaw, Missouri, and we were able to raise money to build a children's hospital for the people up in the Ozarks, up in the hills, like in the show Ozarks. Yeah. And the reason I mention all that was for you people here, try to picture this. And I wasn't the person who did this. One year I went there, and all the celebrities came in. We had, I won't even mention names, but them, all these wonderful people. Rebecca Holden and her husband shows up. And I'm thinking, oh, her husband's going to hike. She is hunt. Now, to do turkey hunting, you have to get up at 3 a.m, and it's usually sometimes stormy, and you're in full camel gear, and you got to trudge through the mud into a forest, and then you got to put yourself down in the forest, against a tree, and wait for hours because the birds are sleeping in the trees. And then when they come down, you call. I won't go into it, but you make a call, and they have to come to you. And it's a whole thing, but it's not glamorous at all. And there was at 3 a.m, they had some kind of breakfast and stuff for us before we went off. Way off into the hills. There's Rebecca and all of her gear, so I give her, and not doing it like, oh, look at me, but really into it. So that was a side of her I didn't know. But unfortunately, it was very hard to write for her, because if you're going to say, the Doppler time band ortho normalization integrator, the pulse modulator is, not working, and we have to sub sync it into a blah, blah, blah. You couldn't do it because, and nothing against her, but Patricia could rattle that stuff off, and most important, you believed that she knew what she was talking about, and even more important, that she's supposed to be the one who invented that. And if you needed something new, she'd come in, she'd say, I know we have that. Listen, I just worked on this. I just fixed this. I just made this stop, blah, blah, blah. And everyone went, yeah. And also, I don't know what they're talking about. I think she was very sexy in a very, intelligent, beautiful way, in a very natural way. And nothing against Rebecca. She tried as hard as she could. I will say, I'm not going to name names, but some of the other people on the show were really so upset about Patricia that they purposely were writing some dialogue that was real tongue twister for poor Rebecca, And so I didn't. But the point is the other part of this, and again, I don't blame her. Of course, this is before emails or comments or anything Instagram. You had these things called letters that people wrote, and the network and a studio, especially the network, got tons of letters from people just hating Rebecca, and she's not someone to hate.
No,
I mean, she's
definitely not someone to hate.
No, she's a lovely person, but she's looking for that part, And she, hey, they cast her. She said, yeah, she did the best she could. It's not her fault. It's not like that great movie All About Eve, where she takes the part away from Betty Davis, oh, mean. It wasn't that at all. She did her thing, and it wasn't fair. But there was such an outcry that, as you know, they brought Patricia back. And for Patricia, I will say one other thing that I do remember. Some other time, if you're ever going to do anything about the Bionic Woman or the $6 Million Man, I could tell you one remarkable story, which I won't get into more detail, but it has to do with somebody getting fired and then getting revenge, being begged to come back and really getting revenge. Patricia just came back, and and I know it had to hurt her, and it has to, as I told you when you're at a star. I remember when she came back, she was just like reunion. It was like a high school reunion. Hey, everybody, hugs and happy. Great to do the work. Let's get to work. And you could feel it in her. There wasn't any of that, because that's every actor's fantasy. Yeah. Nobody comes back to an actor, on knees saying, "We want you back, please. We have to have you. We made a mistake." Yeah.
But,
so anyway, that.
But today, Rebecca is a huge asset for the Knight Rider hobby. She attends conventions, and is always very, very positive in her in the way she talks about the show and promotes the show still. I consider her a good friend of mine. I interviewed her in Atlanta last year, so she's a fantastic lady.
Well, I got to know her pretty well on these. I didn't know her at all on the show, but afterwards. And as I said, as Patricia came back that way, I did, when I ran into Rebecca not that long after, when she was doing these charities, and I also did some conventions. There was one in Vegas that she was at. The other side was true in a very positive way, as you say. She was there. She did her 2 seasons, and she was thrilled. She never saw it because she knew it wasn't her fault. She knew it wasn't anything bad, and it wasn't anyone didn't like her. No. It was just they wanted this, this other kind of glamour, which a person who's supposed to be a techie, in America's mind, that's not the look you want, for that kind. You can't. She could be Charlie's Angel. She couldn't do it. But to her credit. You're absolutely right. I've gone to conventions, and she and what's ironic now, people love to see her.
Yeah.
They love her. And she still looks great.
Yeah.
Too. And I'm not saying that she's older, but that was a while ago. She looks fabulous, and it's all kind of natural looks is what it looks. It's good, but so that is ironic, isn't it? That And, afterwards, when we talked, I didn't know when I first saw her after that. She was just so happy. Oh, hi. And I guess she was involved in, she already got involved in lots of other stuff. And anyway, but those are, because, in our business, there are people who hold grudges to the. Yeah.
So, were you also involved in the season 4 with the RC3 Super Pursuit mode?
Not as much. It's interesting. I don't know if it was in the first season, the last season. I was trying to look to see which episode, which episode it was. I think it was Final Verdict. Now, Final Verdict was in the beginning of the third season. Isn't that correct?
The final verdict was in the first season.
Right, because in Final Verdict, in the third season, there was an episode where I produced a lot of those shows too, but I was also working on another show at the time. Wasn't as involved, but it's interesting because there was a show there that I wrote that I get credit with Janice Hindler, which has to do with someone who, I guess, gets a poison and they've got to find a way.
Dead of Night, yeah.
Dead of Night, yeah, which is my title, Dead of Night. Well, the reason it was called Dead of Night was I always loved, Edward O'Brien made a film noir movie back in the 50s, which I used to see as a little kid. You rarely saw it. It was called DOA. And the idea was, it's a brilliant opening. You see him, like in a film noir, walking down downtown LA through the credits. He's going and going, gets off a bus and goes. He ends up in a police station. And he goes to the, guy, can I help you? I need to see a detective. And he goes, all right, sit down. And he goes into a room, and the guy comes in. He goes, yeah. He says, I need to report a murder. And the guy goes, yeah, all right. He takes a piece of, in the old days, take a piece of paper, puts in the typewriter. What's your name? Okay, and who was murdered? He says, me. And that's how it opened. Isn't that great opening?
Yeah.
Turns out that he knows he's been poisoned, and he only has 24 or 48 hours to live, and he's going to try to find out the person who murdered him before he dies. And so I took that, and we made that into Dead of Night.
Oh, yeah.
And so that was one that I worked on. Now, another quick side story. After Knight Rider, I went to Disney. And I was there for quite a while. And one of the things I did was my miniseries Western, and that's where Meg Ryan got her first start. And I saw, the long story I went to. She was just wonderful. But I stayed at Disney, and when I cast her in the part, I told, and it was amazing. The CEO of Disney, of the entire thing, was Michael Eisner, who was involved in everything. He read all the scripts. He looked at daily, plus all the music, everything, the entire empire of Disney. I don't know how he did it. And we were actually at his house looking at different, and they did screen tests of actresses for the part that she ended up playing. She didn't have a screen test. She was in New York. She did she was sitting in her agent's office. She sat on a stool and told some jokes in old style video, and we put it on his screen. I said, that's it. And then I turned to him and I said, and not only is she do that, but you better put her on contract because she's going to be a big star, do some movies. And so one of the movies that I just suggested it, but I didn't have any part of the movie, was they did a remake of DOA. And it was funny because as someone there, when I mentioned it, they hadn't seen the movie. They said, wasn't there a Knight Rider like that?
Yeah. Awesome.
Then one of my other favorite movies was Fantastic Voyage. And after that, I said, you should do a remake of Fantastic Voyage, which they did, called Inner Space. And the only thing I feel bad about was because she co-starred with Dennis Quaid in both of those, they got married, and that was not the best marriage in the world at the end. But she's, a trillionaire now, happy, got her kids, and she's doing great. But anyway, that was that. But yeah, I was involved in some of those. One interesting thing about, which I think was in fourth or third, I don't know anymore, Kit First's car. That's because
in the third season, yeah.
Now originally, and I have his name, who did the voice of Car originally, who then went on to do all the Transformers.
Yeah.
Who's made a career of that. For some reason, when this was so exciting for me, it's funny because I work with all these major stars and directors and all these, and it's wonderful, but you don't go, but every once in a while there's these certain people, like when Roy Rogers called me, and I was like, I couldn't even talk, and the other person I felt that way was, who did the voice for Kit versus Car, who did Car?
Yeah, it was Peter Cullen.
No, not the second one.
Okay.
It was Paul Frees. Okay. Paul Frees, you might know, is the voice of everything at Disney. You hear that voice that wonderful voice in the Haunted Mansion, in Pirates of the Caribbean, and in Interstate and all the other stuff, and in movies and TV, and Paul Frees is terrifying because I want to. There was an actor we did a show, and he was known to do this, and he died tragically during the series near the end. And Paul Frees was the kind of person, now you do it with AI, but he could come in, hear this, listen for a while to the voice, and then ADR the guy's voice exactly.
Oh, that's awesome.
But Paul Frees at one time could have been the voice of Kit, which is ironic. And you also know, here's another interesting little point. When they originally asked William Daniels if he would do the voice, the evil twin, he said in so many words that he felt it was disrespectful to Kit, and he didn't.
That's cool.
I don't know if he, and he's great, but it was, I guess, smart to use someone else. Yeah. For example, what Michael didn't even, David didn't know originally when he was Garth, when he was his evil twin. Yeah. They dubbed his voice. I don't know if you know that.
No, I didn't. No.
Yeah, but he thought. He kept thinking, boy, I did a good job there, but they really wanted a different voice, so they put a different voice in. But my point is that I was in ADR and I knew what he looked like. No one knows with Paul Frees. He's only done very little on camera, but he did a lot of things with Stan Freberg and others, and lots of cartoons. Like he was like the other Mel Blanc,
So during the show, were there any talks and thoughts about evolving the character of Michael Knight, making him do new things?
There's a couple things to that. One of them is Mouth of the Snake, I think it was called, and that is a disaster. And I feel sorry because it was written. They were told that a character named Dalton, and they were talking about maybe doing a spin-off series.
Code of Vengeance.
Yeah. And but originally Robert Foster and Rob Gilmore wrote a wonderful script, and then they took that script, if I remember, or at least the story, and they said, we're going to make this into also a spin-off for Dalton, and they didn't quite know what it was going to be. But if you remember in that show, it got to a point they kept changing it and they kept rewriting it, and Robert and Rob are some of the most professional, excellent writers I've ever known, and perfectionists. I mean, they really care about their work, and it was really, I remember, kind of upsetting because they had to keep changing, and they say, hey, if you tell us what you want or what this is be, but they didn't know, and so they're like writing, without having, it's like being in a plane without a pilot, and so they were trying to pilot it, and as you know, you hardly see Kit or Michael in that show, and to Michael's credit, though, I think I could be wrong. It was about the time he either just got married or he was going to get married.
Yeah, I heard that as well, that he was actually doing it around his honeymoon or something like that.
Yeah, but as a matter of fact, his marriage is very funny. He's such a nice guy. There was Universal was really pushing their walk, to have Universal Studios and expanding it, not to the point it is now, and a restaurant chain called Fuddruckers got in there, and they really wanted to have something to really push it. And I guess he was either friends with one of the Fuddrucker or the person who's taking it over. So he half kiddingly said, "We're getting married." He says, "Why don't you get married here at Fuddruckers?" He says, "Well, be on TV, and we'll pay for everything." And it wasn't that he's cheap; it was just that sometimes David is such a great guy that he just thought, okay, I'll help him out. And we all went to Fuddruckers for it. And the priest actually says, "Do you, David Hasselhoff, here at Fuddruckers at Universal Studios, marry?" He literally said, and William Daniels was sitting next to me, and he looks at me, he goes, "So, who's going to sponsor the honeymoon? McDonald's?" Okay. But that was very fun. As you know, too, I've been to many conventions, and they get along well now. And they're really good. He's I have to say something about David. He has got that one thing about him. I really don't know if I've met anyone who's not only as professional and decent. And I said to him in a very good way, I said, think of David as your favorite 8-year-old. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean that he is somebody who has an innocence about him, is a trusting. He's an incredibly professional. And one thing I don't know if I ever mentioned was, you said when I first got on the show, I had heard rumors, all turned out to be false, that he was hard to work with, that he came on the set drunk and all, which is total bullshit. But if I can say that word. But anyway,
I'm not gonna edit that out.
yes, podcast, I can say that. But it is, as I said, he was wonderful. But I was concerned. I didn't know David that well. And so this is a funny story, and it's fun. David loves to repeat this story also, that he came to my office to see me, when I just started on the show. And he had read he loved nightmares, oh my God, I'm actually going to do something. And I told him I'm going to beef him up and all. And he walks in, but what I had just done, and I looked around, like my secretary or assistant, as we say now, my assistant said, he wants to come in and see you at whenever, noon. And I'm looking around and I see a script for some reason on a shelf. It was a Magnum script I'd written. And I quickly said to my assistant, I said, I want you to make me up a very official title page on the Knight Rider, title page for the script. And it's called The Death of Michael Knight, by Tom Greene, and I want, a production number and a date and all this. And I said, and she did, and she printed it out. In those days, we didn't have printer. She had to go to, there was one, this is true, at Universal, there was one Xerox machine under the commissary. And you had to get permission to use it. I am not making this up. She ran down to the commissary, and you had to have a special code to use it, made a copy of it, and ran back just in time for me to put it on top of the Magnum script. And I put it on my desk, turned around, and put the chair in front of it for David. And David came in and sat down, and we're starting to talk. And I kind of did things like, had my fingers and hands, kind of get his. So finally he starts to look at it. And at first looking, we're talking, and just nice talk and looking down and looking. And then finally he takes it and picks it up. He looks around and he goes, "Oh, what's this?" I said, "Well, we always like to have an emergency script." And I said, "Listen, I'm just going to be upfront. If you come to the set, and you're not prepared, or you run off with some, floozy to, the Bahamas for the rest of your life, I need to cover myself." I said, so I have this script ready to go. Now, what was so funny is he's concerned. He picks up the script, he starts thumbing through it, but luckily not reading it because it's a Magnum script. There's no, but he just sees. But what he sees is the whole script. Yeah. The whole script act. And to his credit, he goes, he stood up, puts it down, goes to my door, and does the old Michael Knight. And he took it and like, you're right. And he behaved. He was, I behaved. He did what he always did. He was always terrific. But it's funny because I've heard he loves to tell that story about, the producer, he wrote a script to kill me off if I didn't, But that was, and he, as you know, I mentioned this before, but it is important about him. The Wish Upon a Star, I think it's called, was not in existence back then. But we would get letters every once in a while, because of our shows, and it would be a mother saying, my son is dying. Is there any way his wish is to meet with so-and-so, whatever. And, and there's some sorts I won't tell you now, but for only one actor who was horrible about it, we won't go into it, but this happened, of course, on Knight Rider a lot. Yeah. And it's unbelievable, and there's no publicity on this, but I could talk about it now. He was very mad. No photography, no publicity. I don't know anything about it. But if that happened, and we especially remember one specifically, and this boy, this was his whole life was Knight Rider, and he had all the night, and they lived in Ohio or something. On his own, David paid for them to come here. Put them up. We had a Universal Sheraton hotel, which was, right there in the studio. Put them up there. He came in for the day. He had a Knight Rider with his name on, a Knight Rider jacket for him, and all that, it's a lot. You probably have a Knight Rider memorabilia. he had the whole cast and crew there, and we did a scene with him in the car. I get really teary-eyed with him and Michael, and he had William Daniels pre-record. But let's say the kid's name was Billy. Hello, hello, Billy. It's nice to meet you. Are you going to be? You're not going to let Billy drive, are you? And he's just like, and they drove in the back lot, and there's a back huge parking lot, which is in those days, and it's called the Barnum lot, which wasn't used. And he did all these screams, and and he did it himself, and the kids, and of course let him get in himself. And then on the set, we didn't really shoot the scene, and I wish we had video, we could do it, but we actually did as if we shot a scene with him in it. And he went to lunch, and other actors from other things came to him, and it was just an amazing thing. And then about a month or two later, his mother wrote and just said, "You have no idea." He, or more than that, he was only supposed to be around for like 2 more months. He lived for like 8 more months. Always happy. He's just passed away, and we buried him in his Knight Rider jacket. I get really emotional. And David was crying. But that's the kind, that's the kind of person David was.
Yeah. You worked on a lot of other shows as well. Were there any, if you should single out 1 or 2 things that made Knight Rider different compared to a lot of other things you worked on? Are there
I would say the main thing was, after having come off of 3.5 years of Belisario, masterfully brilliant shows. If you ever get these, there are 2 things that I've done in my life that I would say, if someone always say, what would you show people? What are you most proud of? Well, the main thing I'm really proud of is the thing I just finished about my life called Little Victories, but that's not done yet. But they would be producing and doing Tales of the Gold Monkey. And there's some episodes of that. And, of course, Wild Side, which was my miniseries Western, because my father wrote Western novels and is actually in the Hall of Fame in Oklahoma, which has a National Cowboy Association, museum. Those I'm very, very proud of. But my point is that the work that I did for those years, especially on the last thing I had done with Gold Monkey, was 24 hours a day, and I really wanted it to be the best. The reason I mention all that was that at first, as I told you, I'm thinking, even though it's Knight Rider, it's a 24 hours a day. And I had a girlfriend who I had for many years, and actually she was wonderful. She played in every Western, you always have a mortician. It's always a tall, lanky guy who looks after it.
Yeah.
Well, she had been actually a prima ballerina in New York Ballet Company. She was the original. There was a commercial for Irish Spring soap where the girl says, "It's a Mandalay soap, but I like it too." She was an Irish. She had red hair. She was real red hair. She was like Sally Field. She was this perky, wonderful person, and I made her the Undertaker. And you used to say, "Dying's not so bad. Better than a sharp stick in the eye." It's complete. She's full of life. Anyway, and the reason I mentioned that is that she, and that was after I lost my Greek girlfriend because of Belisario took over when I got her, and we just to be frank, I actually always had a thing for Irish girls. I don't know. I almost married her, and I had 2 other real Irish girls. One saved my life, as a matter of fact. But my point of all that was I kind of wanted not to lose her in another show. Now, she was an actress, and she worked all the time. She was on a series called Hotel. She did a lot of stuff. She did a lot of theater. She did choreography. But this can eat you up, and after a while, it gets to be too much. And even though you could be the most even-minded, nice person, it also gets you on edge at times. And the best thing about the whole point of this was that Knight Rider, there were these little funny things that happened, but it was such a romp. It was such a joy. Yeah. It was easy to write. We were able to do some fun things. We were dealing, as I said, this crew, we're like, every day was, and they always were doing parties, birthday parties for people, or bring some kinds of food, or they were playing games. See, the other thing about David Hasselhoff, he didn't lose a lot of money, but he got involved in all these. He couldn't say no to friends who would have, I have an idea for a frisbee that has a twirl on it, or a bulletin that has a and he'd put money into it, and then he'd end up with a whole group of all the. So he'd give them to the whole crew, right? And so we'd be out playing. And one fun thing is he had a ball. It was like a baseball. I forget what it was. There was something different about it. And and to me, we talked about the show Leave It to Beaver. Well, that street that they lived on, and in the opening of every show, you see him walking down the street. That's a set, and it's a whole set street which is still there. And we used to love to run out there and go right in front of the Beaver House and play ball. And he had a certain kind of hula hoop and do all these things. It brought us back to childhood. And it was, the pressure was there. You had to do a show every week. It had to be there. And I do have a story I could tell you where we almost won one of the only huge horror on any show which could happen. It actually happened to Glenn Larson a couple of times earlier on, is you don't make a deadline.
Yeah.
Because you have to make a deadline, and that means they have to put in a rerun. The studio has to reimburse all the money. There's all fine. It's a disaster. We almost had that happen. Now on a Belisario show, that would never happen. Because what Belisario would do is, if he was going to schedule, he didn't care. He'd tell the network, okay, we're shooting on Saturday, which was golden time and meal penalty and all that. And they go, yeah, no, we are, just, F you, I'm doing it, goodbye, which I loved about him. But anyway, we never had that, except for once, which Edward Mulhare saved us, which I could tell that story. But that was
that story in the next part. Yeah.
I was talking, and I've talked to David and other, because I also I worked behind the scenes somewhat with Doug Schwartz when David was doing Baywatch, but then I ended up doing the whole season, which was incredibly fun, of Thunder in Paradise in Florida with Hulk Hogan and Chris Lemon and Patrick McNee, another huge. I mean, he was my hero, and there I am working with Patrick McNee, from the Avengers. But my point is that David and I stayed really close friends, and he talked too about Baywatch was the same thing. I didn't really work that much on it, but he had the same response about Knight Rider, which was, it was a romp. Yeah. And the other thing is nobody, Baywatch, I guess, because it had all the babes and stuff, and that went on for like a million years, and a huge success. And I have to say that the Doug Schwartz especially was an absolute genius who put that together. And David was really fun. And I have to say something about David. He was good about his money, I will say, even though he would do these silly things. Because he used to love to, we would have lunch at, I forget what it was, the famous restaurant in Beverly Hills, Beverly something, the one with the palm trees on the walls that you see. It's the one you see in all the movies. And he liked going there. And between Knight Rider and Baywatch, there was a little bit of a time, and everyone said, it's over. Oh, you had your little bit, it'll get over. And, and I said, David, you have that something. And, and I used to say, it was funny, I said, you could stand alone on the beach, playing volleyball with yourself, and people watch it. Isn't that funny? That used to be and because it had nothing to do with him getting Baywatch or doing Baywatch. But he used to say the same thing. So I will say that the only thing that it was different on a lot of my other shows, especially Wildside. One thing that it's interesting, you guys should know, is when you do a show, even if you do a show for many, many years, you are family, because you see more of the people there than your own family, literally. But sadly, when the show finally ends, everyone goes their separate ways, and in many cases you never see these people again, unless, of course, in this business you do something together. Like I recast, like Alexa Hamilton, for example, who did a brilliant job in Gold Monkey, was in Knight Rider.
Yeah.
You put some others in like that, like what's her name from Magnum. But the only thing I really had some wonderful friends during the time of Night Rider, we used to go out to plays together. There was a steakhouse near there called the Barley Stone, maybe twice a week, a whole bunch of us after work, we'd all go off and it was a place where you choose your steak, in a thing, and then they cook the steak for you. And we all loved that. And that indeed, but and I will say that I think that I know for a fact that on shows that are like that, it comes off. It comes off on the show and people see it. Ironically, did you know that in movies, most of the time, if people are on a show where everyone is having the greatest party time in the world, the movie bombs. It's a terrible movie. When they're like ready to kill themselves or actually get into fistfights, which happen, and they hate it, it's worse. That's the greatest film ever, isn't that?
Yeah.
Just the opposite.
Let's just end our conversation on that note today. And I hope you enjoyed this part 2 of my interview with Knight Rider producer, writer Tom Greene. We will be back in a part 3 where we'll go more in depth on some of the stunts and we'll get more great stories from Tom regarding his time on Knight Rider. See you.